In this video, we're going to show you how to set up API calls, display data from those calls, and update data. So you access API calls in this section right here. And there are 3 ways to create API calls. The first one is that if you have an open API spec, you can import your whole API library. This can be a JSON or YAML file. And I've got a Xano project for this tutorial, so let me show you that. So here in my project, I've got 2 tables, a photos table and a users table. And here are my APIs. And let me go into my Swagger documentation here. And if you just click on this right here, you can see the open API file. And so I'm just going to save this, and then I can just import that Swagger file. And so it's come in as a group here, and I've got all of my calls, and you just want to give it a name, and you can go in and make whatever modifications you need to your calls. So that's the first way. So let's just delete our group here for now. And the second way is to come up into this add menu, and you can create an API group. Now the idea of a group is when you have multiple calls that are going to share data. So they'll have the same base URL, or maybe they'll have the same headers, for instance, an auth token, and all of these headers will propagate down to each one of your calls. So you don't have to add your headers in every call. API groups also give you access to group variables that you can reference in any API call. And the last way is simply just making an API call. And that's where we're going to start. And the first thing we want to do is just display the photos from our database. So let me show you that. So let's come into my photos table right here, and we just have a bunch of photos. And the way we get those is we come over to our API, and we can get them from this endpoint right here, query all photo records. And we can just copy that endpoint, and let's give it a name. So get all photos, and put in the URL. And for this call, that's it. So we're just going to add that call. That is, we don't need any additional headers or query parameters. Okay, next, you want to come over to your response and test. And then we want to test our call, and we're getting the response we're expecting. So we have an array of objects, and each one of these objects is our photo and the metadata of the photo. And so in here, we are currently looking at the body, the response from our call, but you can also see the response headers here. And you also have access to the request header. So we don't have any in here, and the request URL. So here's all our request information, and here's all of our response information. Okay, great. So that body looks good. And the next step is to come down here to our JSON Paths. Now, if you're not familiar with JSON Path, it's a query language. And the purpose of it is that when you're receiving back the response from your server, you're going to use it in very specific ways in your app. So you're going to pull out different fields, different properties from these objects. So if you're returning a list of users, you're probably going to want to display their name and their photo. And you want paths to that information. And you do that with JSON Path. But you don't have to write it yourself because we have recommendations here. And the recommendations are looking at this response and listing right here the most likely paths you're going to want out of this response. So down here, maybe we want to display or use the photo name in our app. Well, if you do, then you want to select it because we're in the recommendations here. So we're going to take whatever we want out of this list, and then when it's selected over here, give it a name, so photo name, and then we'll be able to reference this in our app, and I'll show you that in a second. Now, if you want to see what this query results in, you can just click on preview and it'll show you. Okay, great. Let's close that up. And I actually don't want this for our demo right here, so let's get rid of that. And what I really want is I just want this URL because I want to display my photos. So let's see if we have that in our recommendations, and we do. That's right down here. So we're going to select that and go over to selected and give it a name, and we'll just call this URL and save our call. Okay, beautiful. So we've set up our call. We've set up our JSON paths, so we have something specific to bind to in our app. So let's go display this data. So we're going to come into our builder, and because this is a list of data, I need a widget that can display multiple children. So that could be anything like a column or a row or a list view, but I'm going to use a grid view, which is good for photo. And let's just add in an image. Let's come into our grid view, and we want to come into this background query and add one. And what we want to bind it to is an API call. And in here we have our one API call we set up, and that's it. So we confirm that, and so now our grid view is bound to that. Now, the next step is we have to come over here and to generate dynamic children. And the reason we have to do this is because we've just bound this call to this grid view widget. So that's just kind of sitting out there. We haven't told our grid view to do anything with this data. We just said, hey, when the page loads, go get this data. And so it says, okay, I've got this data. Now what do you want to do? Well, we want to display these images. That is, we have these children here, which for us is just an image, and we want to generate one child for every item in this list. And the way FlutterFlow does that is it's going to take that list and dump it into a variable right here. So let's give it a name. So we're going to call it photos, and then we have to bind that to something. And we want to get that from our response. And then we have the option to say, what from that response do we want to dump into this variable? Let's work down from the top to understand what's going on here. So at the top level, we could bind it to the JSON body, and that would be what we saw when we tested over here. So that would be binding it to all of this right here. And it defaults to that because it's looking to generate children, which means it needs to be a list. So this is an array of objects. So because FlutterFlow is type aware, it says, oh, that's a type I can deal with. Now, the next option in that list is the status code. That would be the status code from the call when you make it back here. So let me show you that. So that would be this 200. And that's in red because, of course, it's not a list. And you got whether it succeeded or not, get a certain response header, that's what we looked at before, or just the raw body text. Okay, well, we want something out of the JSON body, so that's correct. The next option is, do we want to produce these children here based on that whole JSON body or some particular path inside it? And when we select that, we can choose that path we defined or set up a custom path. And normally you're going to do both of these. And let me show you that. So let's start off with that JSON path we defined here. So that URL, and just confirm that. And make sure before you confirm that you actually have a variable name here, photos, and confirm. Now this is just going to tell you that, hey, it's going to dynamically generate children, so you say okay. And FlutterFlow gives you this sort of ghosted out UI here to indicate that when you run this in test mode or run mode, these will be dynamically generated. Okay, so right now we're producing children based on that JSON path we set up. So if we come in here and just look at that path, so let's test our call again, and let's take a look at this. So this is what we're going to be producing children from. So there will be one child for each one of these items in this array here. Okay, so now we've generated a child for each one of those items. And the final step is to bind the data that you need out of there in each one of the children. So let's come into this image here, and the only piece of data out of there we need is the path to where that image sits on the server. So we come down here to path, and we come into our binding, and what we want is not this response right here, but to that photos item. This is that variable we set up. So let's add there, and we don't have any further changes. We'll look at that in a second, but because each one of these items is just the URL, that's what we want. And let's confirm that. All right, so let's test this out. And there we go, it works beautifully. All right, let me show you that other way. So more often than not, this isn't the way that you'll set up your API calls with the bindings like this. And that's because you typically want to pull more information from each child than just one thing like the URL. Now, this is a perfectly appropriate way to do it, but let me show you this other way. So we're going to go back into our grid view right here, into our generate children from variable. And instead of binding to that JSON path, we're just going to bind to our body and confirm. Let me show you what that actually means. So if we come back into our API calls, let's call that again here. And also let's look at our response right here. So you always have to bind to a list of something, a collection of something. And before, we bound to this list right here. So the only thing we have access to is the URLs. Instead, this time we are binding to this whole response. So the children are these objects right here. So this will be the first child, and this will be the next child right here. Now, the difference is that this way we have access to all this information in here, but it means that we have to write individual JSON paths for whatever we want. So for instance, if we want to duplicate the page layout that we currently have, we're going to need access to this URL. And to do that, we have to know the JSON path there. Now, this is no problem. It works with dot notation, just like with objects and maps in many programming languages. So to get there, we're going to look for photo.url. So let's go over and show you how to set that up. So our binding here is correct. The only difference is the binding in each one of our images. So let's come in right here, and we're still binding to our photo item. But if we did no further changes, we wouldn't see anything here because this is just returning the whole object of that image. And we want something specific. We want the photo URL. So we want a JSON path out of there, and it has to start with this $, and we do $, then we go for photo, and then .url, and confirm that. All right, let's take a look at that. So reload, and it works the same way. Okay, so that's how to set up a GET request and view some data. But let's look at some more in-depth things where we need headers and a body. So let's set up a POST request. Okay, let's go back to our APIs here and add another call. And for this call, we want to add a photo to our collection. So we're going to call it add photo. This is going to be a POST request, and the URL is going to be the same as this one. So we can just paste that in, and let's just add our call to save it. The next thing for a POST call is we need a body because we're posting, sending something. And in your body right here, you can choose whatever type of body this API is expecting, and you can just look at your API documentation to see what it's expecting. Now for this, because we're sending a file, we're going to use a multi-part, and let's look at our API to see what parameters we need. So we need this post endpoint right here. So let's take a look, and if we select this input right here, we just need an image. Okay, great. So let's add a parameter. We're going to call it image, and it's going to be an uploaded file. But we've run into a problem because if we set it up like this, we're going to be sending just whatever photo we set up in here. That's because we are hard coding this value. That is, the value of this image is a specific value, which right now is just empty. But what we want is we want the value to be whatever the user uploads. So we don't want this from a specific value, like a hard-coded value right here. We want it from a variable. That is, a variable that the user will upload. That is, whatever the user will upload. It will be variable. It will be dynamic. Okay, so let's select our variable, but we haven't created the variables yet. Now, if you select create new variable here, it'll create a variable based on this name, but let's do this manually so we can see the whole process. So let's come over to variable here and add a new variable, and we can just call this photo, and it's of type uploaded file, and it is not a list. Okay, so we've got this variable. So now we can go back to our body here, and when we select our variable, now we've got it. One thing to note is that if you're using JSON for your body, your variables will show up here, and you can just drag them into your body. Okay, but we're not using JSON, so let's go back to our multi-part, and it remembers, so that's great. Okay, so this is all set up. So we've got our URL, we've got our body, and we'll send along an image from the user. Okay, so now we need to set this up in the UI. So let's save our call, And let's go into our builder. All right, so what do we want to do? Well, let's add in a button so that when the user clicks it, they can upload that image and we can then send it along through our post request to our server. All right, so we need a button and we can just use a floating action button. Let's add in an icon and let's add in a plus sign so we get a little visual indication of what it is. And let's change the color. Beautiful. Okay, so let's define this logic now. So we'll select our button. We'll go into our action flow editor. We'll add an action and we want this to trigger an upload of an image. So we search for upload and it's going to be media for us and we'll accept all the defaults right here. That's fine. And it's just good to rename our output here so we understand what it is. So we can just say uploaded photo. Beautiful. So the user uploads the photo and then we're going to want to make that post request using this photo that they've uploaded. Okay, so we need more space here. Let's open our action flow editor. And then we want an API call. And we've got our add photo call right here. And we know we have one variable that we set up here. And that variable is our photo. That's that variable that we set up when we were setting up our call. Of course, we don't want a hard-coded value. We want a dynamic value. And we want that photo, which is in this widget state right here. It's this uploaded local file. Beautiful. Next and finally, let's just add in a little snack bar to indicate if our call is successful. So let's just search for snack bar and we can just say photo uploaded. And we can just copy this and paste it in here. And if it didn't work, we want to just print whatever message we get back. And so let's look at our action outputs. And this is the response right here from our call. And we can just print the JSON body. That's fine. Okay, let's close this out and test it out. Okay, so we've got 10 images right here. Let's add in another one. We got this gallery. Let's add that in. Photo uploaded, boom, and we see it. Beautiful. All right, lastly, what if we had authentication on our APIs? Like, what if we needed some headers? How would we do that? Well, let's look at that. Let's come into our APIs, and if we had authentication on both of these, it would be better to put this into a group. So let's add in a group, and we'll just call this photos, and let's give it a base URL. And so here's our URL, and the base one is just going to be up to here. So we can remove this and let's just save it, add group. And I've added authentication to both of my endpoints. And so it requires an authorization and a bearer token. And I'll paste that in. Great. Now, down here in advanced group settings, you've got the ability to make this call private. What this will do is it'll route this API call through a cloud function. And you would want to do this if you have any sensitive information in the call, like for instance, an API token. By default, FlutterFlow sets up proxies for testing and for run and test mode. That's testing in your API call that we were demonstrating before. This is just to avoid CORS issues. And you have the option to use a custom proxy. Okay, great. Let's save this. And now you can just twirl open your group and add an API call just like before. We've already seen this, so I'm just gonna copy these in. All right, so we've set up these two API calls now. And so those headers will propagate down to each one of the calls inside this group. And you have the ability to add additional headers. Finally, there's one other place where you can use variables, and that's inside the URL. So maybe I want to get a specific photo. Well, I've got an endpoint for that in Xano. Let me show you that. So here I've got this endpoint that is expecting the photo ID. So let me show you how we would set that up. And the photo ID is just the ID in the database. So this yellow one right here has an ID of 1. So let's grab that. So we don't need authentication. So we're just going to make a new call here. It's going to be get photo, and the endpoint is this, except for we're going to need a variable there. So it's going to be slash and then the variable. And the way you reference variables here is in square brackets. Now we haven't set this up yet, so let's set up our variable. and we'll just call this photo ID, and it's going to be a string. So now we can just copy this and dump it in here and add that call. And let's test it. Now, when you're in test mode and you've got a variable here, you can add in the value you want to test with. So let's just test on that 1. We want to include it, of course, and let's test our call. Beautiful. There we get it. We get one object, and it's that photo. And if we try a different value, we get a different photo. Beautiful. And if we look at our API URL that we sent, we can see that we've got our photos and then the ID right there. Of course, we can change it, and it'll change it in the request URL. And that's how to set up API calls in FlutterFlow.